1/100th of a gram. That is the amount of botulism toxin it takes to stop your diaphragm from moving. The terrifying part is that the difference between a jar of perfectly safe, home-canned green beans and a jar that contains that toxin is not visible, not smellable, and not detectable by taste. It comes down to a single number on the pH scale, and a single piece of equipment that nearly 40% of home canners are using incorrectly. I am going to show you the exact rule that separates the foods that need a water bath from the foods that demand a pressure canner, because getting it wrong does not mean a spoiled jar. It means a trip to the ICU. This confusion sends more people to the hospital every year than any other home cooking mistake. And it is exploding right now because a new generation is taking up canning for the first time, often learning from a blurry video that skips the one safety rule that matters. So I went straight to the research that the USDA has been screaming into the void for 50 years. And the answer starts with a number most people have never heard of: 4.6. 4.6 is the pH level that separates a safely preserved meal from a neurotoxin with no antidote. If the food inside a sealed jar falls below that threshold, Clostridium botulinum spores cannot germinate. They go dormant, harmless. But if the food sits above 4.6, those spores wake up in the oxygen-free environment of a sealed jar. They multiply, and they produce a toxin so potent that a quantity the size of a grain of salt can kill a full-grown adult. The difference between those two outcomes is not minutes of boiling or how tight you screw the lid. It is determined entirely by which canning machine sits on your stove. And here is the thing. Nobody online is telling you you cannot see the danger. The jar looks perfect. The seal is tight. The food looks wonderful. A grandmother in Ohio learned this the hardest way possible in 2015. She canned potatoes from her garden using a boiling water bath just like her own mother had taught her. Potatoes are low acid. They sit well above 4.6 on the pH scale. The boiling water never reached the temperature required to kill the spores. 2 weeks later, at a church potluck, 29 people fell violently ill. 1 died. An entire community learned in a single Sunday afternoon that tradition is not a safety guarantee. What happened in that kitchen is happening right now across the country, because home canning is undergoing the biggest resurgence since the Great Depression. Seed companies sold out in 2020. Pressure canners vanished from store shelves. Millions of people watched a 5-minute tutorial and assumed they understood the difference between the two methods. But the USDA and the National Center for Home Food Preservation have been tracking a pattern that terrifies food safety researchers. A significant percentage of new canners are matching the wrong food to the wrong method. And the one food that scares them the most is the very crop that beginners find easiest to grow. Tomatoes. Tomatoes. The one crop that beginners find easiest to grow is the crop that food scientists fear the most. And the reason is baked into the genetics of modern produce. Your grandparents grew tomato varieties that hovered around a pH of 4.4, naturally acidic, safely below the danger line. But over decades, plant breeders selected for sweetness, for meatiness, for low acid flavor profiles, because that is what customers wanted at the grocery store. A dole tomato, a big boy, a brandywine. These modern varieties often sit at a pH of 4.8, 4.9, even 5.0. That is solidly in the danger zone. And if you water bath can those slices without adding lemon juice or citric acid, you are not making a shelf-stable jar. You are constructing a botulism incubation chamber. In April of 2015, a woman in Fairfield County, Ohio, did exactly what millions of families have done for generations. She harvested potatoes from her garden. She washed them. She packed them into jars. And she processed them in a boiling water bath canner. The jars sealed perfectly. Weeks later, she made a potato salad for a Sunday potluck at Cross Point Free Will Baptist Church in Lancaster. 21 people ate that salad. One day later, the first patient collapsed. By the end of the week, 29 people were hospitalized with blurred vision, drooping eyelids, and a paralysis that crept from their shoulders down to their diaphragm. One woman, a 55-year-old mother of 3, died on a ventilator. The CDC investigators found canned potatoes still sitting on her pantry shelf. They tested them. The pH was 5.8. The jars were loaded with botulinum toxin, and they looked like they came straight from a magazine cover. That is the terror of Clostridium botulinum. It does not produce gas. It does not create a foul smell. It does not cloud the brine. The food looks unspoiled. The seal holds firm. And inside a teaspoon of that potato salad carried enough toxin to kill every person in that church. Now, the rule that separates the Ohio grandmother from a safe pantry is so simple that its simplicity is the trap. If a food is naturally high in acid, with a pH below 4.6, boiling water at 212 degrees Fahrenheit is enough stop. The acid prevents spores from waking, and the heat kills the active bacteria. That is water bath canning. It works for pickles swimming in vinegar. It works for jams heavy with sugar and lemon juice. It works for fruits like peaches and pears. But low-acid foods, every vegetable, every meat, every soup stock, require a completely different machine, because 212 degrees is not sufficient to destroy bacterial spores. You must reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature is physically impossible in an open pot of boiling water. The only way to reach it is to trap steam under pressure, raising the boiling point of water high enough to achieve what food scientists call a 12D process. That means a 12-log reduction in spore count. It reduces the probability of a single surviving spore to roughly 1 in a trillion. That is the safety standard for every can of green beans and corn you buy at the grocery store, and that standard is met exclusively by a pressure canner. But here is where the story takes a sharp and terrifying turn. Because even when people understand the difference, even when they buy the right equipment, they are still dying. And the culprit is a machine that was never, ever supposed to be used for canning. Yet it is sold on the same aisle at half the price with a label that confuses millions. A pressure cooker, not a pressure canner. The names sound interchangeable, and the people who sell them count on that. A pressure cooker is designed to cook food fast. It slams up to high pressure, cooks a pot roast in 40 minutes, and then the heat cycles off. It holds temperature for roughly the time it takes to soften a carrot, not the 75 uninterrupted minutes required to destroy botulinum spores in a jar of green beans. A pressure canner is a fundamentally different machine. It is larger, heavier, and engineered to maintain a precise pressure, and therefore a precise temperature, for hours without fluctuation. When the USDA tests processing times, they validate them in a pressure canner, not a pressure canner, not a pressure cooker. Those times are not suggestions. They are the difference between a 12-log reduction of spores and a jar full of survivors. But millions of people are buying countertop electric multicookers with a button labeled canning and assuming the algorithm knows more than the National Center for Home Food Preservation. In 2021, the Utah State University Extension tested 5 electric pressure cookers marketed for canning. Not a single one reached the sustained internal temperature needed for safe, low-acid canning. Jars of green beans processed in them still had cool spots at the center after the cycle finished. The food looked canned, the lids sucked down, but the spores were never exposed to 240 degrees Fahrenheit for long enough to die. The machines were producing beautiful, deadly jars, and the companies knew it. Their manuals buried a single line in microscopic print. For high-acid foods only. That means the canning button is only safe for water bath recipes. But the packaging never screams that distinction. It shows a picture of a jar full of vegetables. It says pressure canning, and a first-time canner who wants to fill a pantry with green beans and potatoes, buys it, uses it, and feeds her family from it for a year, without ever knowing she rolled the dice every single time she opened a lid. And even when a home canner does everything right, buys the heavy $400 pressure canner, follows a tested recipe, adds the lemon juice to the tomatoes, there is still one silent variable that wipes out all that preparation. Altitude. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, but for every 500 feet you climb, the boiling temperature drops by roughly 1 degree. In Denver, the mile-high city, water boils at about 203 degrees. A water bath canner that never exceeds boiling temperature is now running 10 degrees cooler, which means it takes even longer to kill what bacteria it can reach. For pressure canners, the gauge setting must be increased to compensate for lower atmospheric pressure. If you process your green beans at 10 pounds of pressure in Leadville, Colorado, you are underprocessing them by more than a third. The USDA publishes altitude adjustment charts for every single recipe they have tested. They are mandatory, and almost nobody follows them because the instructions got lost between the garden and the kitchen. That is the reality of home canning in the 21st century, a resurgence of tradition colliding with engineered confusion from appliance companies, invisible environmental variables, and a bacterium that leaves no trace until a family sits down to dinner. But after all of this, the solution is not to abandon canning. It is to know one rule. One distinction so simple that if you internalize it, you will never mix up the methods again. And it all comes back to the number that started this story, 4.6. That one number is the entire rule. If the food you are putting in that jar naturally sits below 4.6 on the pH scale, you can process it in a boiling water bath canner. Think pickles soaked in vinegar. Think jams that are practically half sugar and lemon juice. Think peaches and apples and berries. The acid is your preservative. The boiling water just drives out the oxygen and kills the active bacteria. But if that food sits above 4.6, and that means every vegetable from your garden, every piece of meat, every stock, every soup, you need a pressure canner that reaches 240 degrees Fahrenheit and holds it for the full time listed on a USDA-tested recipe. That is the only way to guarantee the spores are dead. There is no shortcut, no old family method, no amount of boiling at 212 degrees that can substitute for pressure. And the one crop that straddles the line is the tomato, because modern tomatoes can drift above 4.6. The rule for them is add acid, 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice per quart, 1 teaspoon of citric acid. That forces the pH down into the safe zone and lets you water bath, can them without fear. Skipping that step, because your grandmother never did it, is gambling that her tomato variety was more acidic than yours. It probably was. Yours might not be. That gamble cost a woman in Ohio her life and nearly killed 28 other people. But there is a piece of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it is the reason this knowledge is more urgent right now than at any time since the 1940s. The spores that cause botulism are not a freak contaminant. They are everywhere. They live in the soil of your garden, in the dust on your potatoes, in the water you rinse with. You cannot wash them away. You cannot starve them out. They are invisible and they are patient. The only thing they need to become lethal is a low oxygen, low acid, room temperature environment. A sealed canning jar of green beans is exactly that. And when you open that jar 6 months later and put the beans in a casserole, the toxin is already fully formed. It doesn't need to multiply inside your body. It just needs to be swallowed. The only method that interrupts this chain is a pressure canner that reaches and holds 240 degrees for the full validated time. Anything less is an experiment, and the deadliest part is that the experiment usually looks like it worked. Now, the question you are probably asking is, where do I start if I want to do this right? The answer is not complicated. Buy a weighted gauge pressure canner. Learn to adjust for your altitude. Use only recipes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation or your state extension service. And never, under any circumstance, push a canning button on a machine that cost $80 and promises to do everything, because the people who got sick did not think it could happen to them either. They were not careless. They were misinformed. And the single best thing you can do right now is fix that gap for yourself. Which brings me to the final and strangest detail. The same bacterium that makes canning deadly is also the source of the most famous anti-aging injection in human history, Botox. The same neurotoxin that paralyzes facial muscles is chemically identical to the one that stops your diaphragm. The difference is dose and location. A few billionths of a gram injected with precision smooths a wrinkle. A few billionths of a gram more in your bloodstream kills you. That is the razor's edge we are talking about. That is why the pressure canner matters. The story of Clostridium botulinum is ultimately a story about what we cannot see. It lives in the soil beneath every garden, invisible and patient, waiting for precisely the conditions we accidentally create. For 80 years, pressure canners have been the only proven barrier between those spores and a dinner table. But in the last 5 years, a flood of half-truths and confusing marketing has convinced a new generation that a button on a countertop gadget can replace heavy steel and tested science. The people who died in Ohio were not reckless. They were trusting. They trusted family tradition. They trusted an appliance label. They trusted that if a jar sealed, it was safe. It was safe. That trust cost a life, and it is costing more every year as canning surges without the education that used to come with it. I want you to walk into your kitchen tonight. Look at the jars on your shelf and ask one question. Did I reach 240 degrees? If the answer is no, those jars are not preserved. They are time capsules of risk. If this video made sense to you, there is a special offer through the link in the first pinned comment. It is the tool I built to put all of this in one place. Hit subscribe, not for me, for what comes next. Because the next thing we are covering is the one preservation method the Amish never abandoned, and it doesn't require electricity at all.